In April 1945, as the war in Europe was drawing to a close, thousands of German soldiers and civilians were being captured and transported across unfamiliar landscapes. Among them were women, soldiers, auxiliaries, and civilians caught in the vast machinery of conflict. They had been told what to expect. They had been told of harsh treatment, scarcity, and humiliation at the hands of the Allies. They believed that surrender meant the end of dignity, the end of security, the end of control. For many, the journey to British-controlled camps was filled with fear and tension. Trains rattled across the countryside, carrying a silent load of women who clutched their few belongings, wrapped in worn coats, blankets, and the weight of propaganda-fueled expectations. Each mile seemed to stretch time, each station a reminder of vulnerability. Letters from German women later described the anxiety. One woman wrote, "We had been warned not to trust the British. We expected cruelty, mockery, strictness beyond comprehension. We imagined bars, guards, and harsh words at every step." The images etched in their minds were not based on personal experience, but on stories, rumors, and the repeated warnings of superiors. The trains finally arrived at small stations near rural camps. The women stepped onto platforms of mud and spring chill, clutching children or bundles of personal belongings. They were greeted not with shouting. The psychological contrast was already apparent. The women had expected chaos and humiliation. They found, instead, structure and discipline. Yet their internal tension remained. Every cautious step was weighed with suspicion. Every smile, every neutral expression was analyzed for hidden intent. Could trust exist here? Would a simple mistake lead to punishment? Their minds raced with questions they could not answer. The camps themselves were modest, but orderly. Barracks were clean, floors swept, bunks arranged in rows. Simple furnishings, a cot, a small table, and a chair, were more than the women had hoped for. Mess halls were prepared for large numbers, and the smell of food, though plain, carried warmth. For many, the sight of such order was disorienting. One diary entry read, "We had imagined cages, darkness, endless lines for meager rations. Instead, there were tables set for each of us. We froze, unsure if we should sit, if we were allowed." The British officers were deliberate in their calm. Guards did not shout. They did not display weapons unnecessarily. Instructions were delivered in measured tones, each word chosen to reduce confusion. The women were told where to sleep, where to wash, where to collect meals. Every step was accompanied by this quiet guidance, a subtle assertion of control that did not rely on. The preparation for daily life was methodical. Camp routines included roll calls, meals at fixed times, and tasks that were necessary for communal living. These routines, instead of inspiring fear, gradually introduced a strange stability. For women who had spent years under bombing raids, forced labor, or constant military discipline, the predictability of the camp schedule was both foreign and reassuring. Yet the mind remained alert, questioning every detail. Letters and diaries show that anticipation shaped perception as much as reality. One former prisoner wrote, "We walked slowly to each meal, eyes on the soldiers, expecting insults, expecting orders we could not follow. Every neutral glance felt like a test. Every nod seemed suspicious. We were trained to fear, and fear was ready to meet us. But the reality was different." Some women tried to assert the behaviors they believed would protect them. They moved with stiffness, kept distance from the soldiers, and whispered in corners. The expectation of hostility was deeply ingrained. They had rehearsed reactions for every imagined affront. Their internal world was crowded with anxiety, strategy, and apprehension. Meanwhile, British officers observed carefully. They understood the importance of calm and predictability. They had read reports from other camps, studied reactions, and noted that harsh treatment often led to resistance, silence, or breakdown. They chose to meet fear with order, suspicion with patience. Their approach was clinical, almost observational. Transportation to camps, the initial registration, and allocation of sleeping quarters all followed protocols designed for efficiency, not intimidation. Yet, for the women, every step was a test of nerves. They expected inspection rooms to be cold, harsh, invasive. They expected long questioning, suspicion in every glance. Instead, forms were filled out, belongings recorded, and identification assigned, all in a quiet, controlled environment. The gap between expectation and reality created tension. In small moments, hesitation revealed the psychological state of the prisoners. They froze at doorways, lingered before washing stations, and hesitated at the sound of instructions. One letter described standing in line for meals. We did not know if we should move forward. We looked at each other, uncertain. The soldiers did not hurry us. We waited, and in the waiting, fear stretched longer than the walk itself. Even the provision of food carried weight. Rations were simple, bread, soup, porridge, but abundant by the standards they had been taught to expect. Many women paused, unsure if to eat immediately. Hunger warred with disbelief. Diaries describe moments where prisoners would sit with a bowl of soup in hand, staring at it, thinking it might be poisoned or a trap. I held the bread in my hands. I was afraid to break it. It seemed too generous, too deliberate. What was the catch? Rumors traveled fast among the camp's daily schedule, though structured, was designed to introduce autonomy within boundaries. Women were allowed to organize their own sleeping areas, maintain personal hygiene, and participate in limited tasks. These small freedoms, intended to maintain order, challenged the prisoners' ingrained belief that surrender meant total loss of agency. For some, this led to confusion. For others, relief. At night, when the camp grew quiet, the psychological tension persisted. Barracks were silent, yet minds were restless. Diaries from April 1945 show that many women lay awake, recounting the day, questioning every interaction, interpreting neutral glances as judgment, analyzing every action for hidden meaning. Sleep came slowly, often only after exhaustion overtook vigilance. By the third day, small adjustments began. Women started to move more freely within barracks, though hesitantly. Some began to eat without waiting for permission. Letters described whispered conversations about the unexpected calm, the orderly meals, the surprising absence of harassment. Yet the internal war continued. Distrust warred with relief, fear warred with observation, expectation warred with reality. Camp authorities encouraged this cautious acclimation. They did not force interactions. Even in shared spaces, the emotional contrast was apparent. Women would sit side by side, eyes wide, waiting for an incident that never came. They would glance at soldiers, expecting reprimand, only to find calm, steady observation. One diary entry reads, "We waited for a word of anger. We waited for a shout. It never came. We looked at each other in disbelief. Was this how it was meant to be?" The slow, methodical approach of the British camp staff created micro moments of shock. Each small act, allowing choice of bunk, serving food in order, providing clean water, was at odds with months of fear conditioning. For women whose minds were tuned to crisis, every ordinary act became extraordinary. By the end of the first week, some women began tentative steps toward adaptation. They began to sit in the mess hall without hesitation. They began to wash and organize their belongings without fear of punishment. Yet anticipation remained. Their minds were trained to expect reversal, to expect a sudden shift from calm to cruelty. One woman wrote, "Every day I waited for the storm that never came. I knew it was coming. It had to be coming. Yet it did not." The psychological tension was a delicate balance. And then, as April 1945 turned toward May, small notices appeared. Walks outside the barracks, small tasks in gardens or kitchens, letters delivered from outside, opportunities to read newspapers in controlled spaces. Each was a test, subtle, deliberate. Each was a moment in which anticipation met reality. The women watched, questioned and reflected, their internal dialogue rich with tension. It was during one of these quiet moments, as women lined up for meals, as guards observed without interference, that the next stage of experience approached. The moment when the expectation of fear would collide with the reality of order, provision, and basic human courtesy was about to unfold. The tension was almost tangible. Every eye surveyed the scene, every hand lingered over a coat or a bundle, every mind raced with what might happen next. And so, the scene was set. The prisoners, poised between belief and disbelief, fear and curiosity, anticipation and hesitation, waited. The quiet order of the camp pressed against their expectations. The morning after their first full day in the camp, the German women waited with silent tension for the events they believed would define their captivity. They expected shouting, inspections, or some strict demonstration of control. Instead, the routine continued in quiet, measured order. Breakfast was served in the mess hall. The long tables were lined with bowls of steaming soup, fresh bread, and simple porridge. The women froze at the doorway. Some clutched their coats tightly, hesitant to step forward. Others moved slowly, eyes scanning for hidden threats, for signs that this calm was only a mask. One soldier, young and uncertain, held her hand over her mouth, whispering to a friend, "Do they want something from us?" The answer was nothing more than a neutral glance from a British guard. For the first time, hunger met abundance. Their expectations of scarcity collided with reality. Diaries later recounted the surreal experience. "We sat at the table and our hands trembled over bread and soup. No one shouted, no one ordered us to eat quickly. We did not know if it was allowed. We simply could not." Outside the barracks, the women noticed further details that challenged their expectations. Gardens were tended by other prisoners, paths swept, small flowers planted. British soldiers moved through the camp, giving instructions in calm, low tones. No one shouted, no one struck, no one humiliated. The psychological impact was subtle but profound. It was as though the women were being told, without words, that they were still human, still capable of ordinary life. Letters from April 1945 describe the growing dissonance. "Every day I expected a blow, an insult, a command I could not follow. Instead, we were allowed to fold our own laundry, make our own beds, and even help in the kitchens. I waited for the punishment that never came." The women began to watch each other closely, noticing similar hesitation, similar disbelief. In shared observation, they found a muted community of astonishment. Food continued to be a focal point of psychological adjustment. Meals were simple, yet abundant. Bread, soup, porridge, occasionally fruit or preserves. For women who had endured years of rationing, these small provisions were almost unimaginable. Many held their utensils in hand for moments, expecting a reprimand for taking too much or moving too slowly. One diary noted, "We did not understand that the food was ours, freely given. It was patience that taught us to eat without fear." The British officers' quiet demeanor played a central role. They did not seek gratitude. They did not praise or scold. They simply maintained calm, predictable order. Over time, this consistency began to erode the prisoner's suspicion. They began to anticipate that kindness did not always signal a trap, that the absence of cruelty was itself a form of authority. Even minor freedoms became sources of surprise. Women were allowed to write letters home, though monitored. They were permitted to walk short distances outside the barracks. They could organize small tasks among themselves. Each act seemed ordinary to the British, yet it was extraordinary to the prisoners. "I walked to the garden," one woman wrote, "and the sun was warm. I was allowed to be outside, to breathe freely. My mind expected fear. There was none." Observation of British routines reinforced this psychological contrast. Guards followed procedures, but without display of aggression. Officers spoke quietly. Work was distributed fairly. Supplies arrived on schedule. The women began to notice patterns, small assurances that the environment was controlled but not cruel. This regularity created an internal tension, part relief, part disbelief. Micro moments revealed the depth of the psychological shock. One morning, a group of women lined up for a meal. They froze at the sight of steaming bowls. Some whispered, unsure if they should proceed. A young soldier offered a small smile. No one told her to move forward. She took a tentative step. Another followed. By the time the line had moved halfway, the hall was quiet, orderly, almost serene. The ordinary act of eating had become a profound encounter with unexpected humanity. The women began to talk quietly about these experiences. Diaries show repeated mentions of disbelief. "We had been trained to expect cruelty," one entry reads, "yet we found calm. We expected punishment, yet there was patience. We expected distrust, yet there was order. Our minds struggled to reconcile expectation with reality." The psychological impact extended beyond fear and trust. It touched identity, autonomy, and dignity. For years, the women had been trained to surrender personal judgment to orders, propaganda, and military discipline. The camp offered an environment where thought, observation, and small choices were allowed. This subtle liberation created confusion, reflection, and eventually quiet relief. One striking account describes the reaction to a simple act of courtesy. A British officer helped a woman carry a bundle of laundry to the drying yard. She froze, uncertain whether to accept help. The act carried no demand, no expectation, yet her internal dialogue raced. Was this a test? Was there a hidden insult? Slowly, she accepted the help. Later, she wrote, "I did not know a man could help without judgment. I did not know I could accept it without shame." Even communal work became an arena for reflection. Women swept floors, organized supplies, or tended small gardens. Their movements were observed but not ordered. They learned cooperation without fear, self-reliance within structure. One diary noted, "We worked side by side, without yelling, without threat. It was hard to comprehend. I expected scolding for every mistake. None came." The provision of letters and news reinforced the contrast. Women could read updates from the outside world, allowed brief glimpses of normal life. They wrote home, cautiously, unsure of how to phrase words without offense or misinterpretation. One entry reflects the dissonance. By the second week, the psychological shift became more evident. Women moved more freely, ate without hesitation, and began to notice subtler aspects of camp life. They observed flowers, birds, weather, and the routines of soldiers. Small pleasures, warm sunlight, quiet conversation, the rhythm of orderly life, contrasted sharply with the tension of expectation. One of the most profound adjustments involved silence. The women had been trained to respond to authority with constant vigilance, anticipating anger or punishment in every sound. In the calm, measured environment of the camp, silence became reflective rather than threatening. Diaries frequently note the sense of weight in quiet moments, how absence of shouting or threat created new space for thought, memory, and anticipation. Letters provide another perspective. One woman wrote to a friend, "We waited for cruelty. We expected humiliation. Instead, we were allowed to sit, to speak, to breathe. Every day was a test, and every day we passed it, not by fear, but by observation. We learned patience, confusion, and slowly a strange relief." Unexpected kindness also extended to medical care. Women with injuries or illness were treated promptly, without question. The provision of care without judgment challenged the belief that surrender meant abandonment. One diary entry reads, "I had a fever. I expected neglect or punishment. Instead, they brought medicine and blankets. I did not know help could come without price." The contrast between propaganda and reality shaped lasting impressions.
The women had been told that the Allies were cruel, that surrender meant degradation. Instead, they discovered a regime of controlled order, structured care, and deliberate patience. The mind struggled to reconcile expectation and experience. Many recorded the phenomenon as both disorienting and enlightening. Small, repeated acts of normality became cumulative lessons. Clean sleeping quarters, organized meals, provision of water, opportunities to walk, and personal choice, all mundane to the British, were extraordinary to the prisoners. Diaries consistently described disbelief. Every ordinary act was extraordinary. Every neutral glance, every patient instruction, every quiet order contradicted years of fear. By the third week, internal tension began to shift from vigilance to cautious acceptance. Women no longer froze at the dining hall, no longer hesitated to accept help, no longer whispered constantly. Their bodies adjusted, their minds slowly reconciled with reality, but anticipation of reversal remained. Trust was not yet complete, but the first steps towards psychological adaptation were visible. The letters, diaries, and reports all point to a common theme: the shock of unexpected civility. Women who had imagined harshness, who had rehearsed responses to abuse, discovered that ordinary, structured care could be more disorienting than violence. They learned that human dignity could exist even within captivity.
One poignant account captures the essence of the experience. We had prepared ourselves for everything but calm. We had imagined bars, yelling, deprivation. Instead, we found bread, beds, and quiet. At first, we waited for something terrible to happen. Slowly, we realized it would not. That realization was more frightening than fear itself. Observation of fellow prisoners reinforced understanding. Women watched each other's reactions, noting frozen hesitation, trembling hands, and wide eyes. Shared disbelief created a silent community, a mutual acknowledgement of shock and reflection. As April turned into May, the routine of camp life continued. The psychological effects became more stable. Women could engage in small conversations, perform tasks without fear, and rest without constant vigilance. Yet the experience left lasting impressions on their understanding of human behavior. In letters written decades later, survivors reflected on the subtle lessons of those weeks. Many described a profound awareness of expectation versus reality. One wrote, "I learned that fear can be shaped by anticipation more than experience. I learned that calm, ordinary actions can transform perception. I learned that dignity can survive even surrender." By the end of part 2, the shock had settled into reflection. The women, once poised on the edge of fear, had encountered a reality far different from expectation. Their internal landscapes had shifted. Anticipation and dread had given way to observation, understanding, and cautious adaptation. The story of these women in British camps illustrates a deeper truth about human psychology in wartime. Fear is often built not only from past experience, but from expectation, rumor, and preparation. When reality diverges from these expectations, the mind experiences a form of quiet shock. The ordinary can become extraordinary. Simple kindness can unsettle deeply ingrained fear. Structure and calm can feel disorienting after chaos. In the end, the captured German women learned that survival was not only a matter of enduring hardship, but also of observing, adapting, and recalibrating the mind. The quiet order of the British camps left them with memories of disbelief, reflection, and an enduring lesson in the power of expectation, perception, and human dignity.